Hello, class. Good evening, good morning, good day, depending on what time of the day you're watching this. I hope you all are having a good week. Today we're going to talk about issues of intersectionality, feminism within the context of the GLBTQ population. This particular slide is just a review of the themes from last week. I don't want to take up too much time talking about that because I want to limit this recording to about 10 minutes. But identity development, so think about that, and these are themes that will continue with this population. Samuel's, one of the main points that she makes regarding identity development is that there's no end for the transracial population. It's always an identity that they continue to negotiate throughout life, and even from one context to another. The legacy of race was discussed, both in terms of race matching, and then Samuels gives a very nice historical context to issues of race and how those played out in transracial adoptions. The idea of the feminism, intersectionality, that continues to be discussed within those readings. And then, of course, you guys had readings on international adoptions, looking at the family life cycle, and then also just thinking about international adoptions and how that is similar or different to transracial adoptions within the United States. And there's a lot of common themes in terms of transracial, transcultural adoptions and some of the similar issues for those adoptees. And what are those implications for both you as a clinician and for parenting? So just kind of hold some of those ideas because in some ways they will continue to apply to this week's readings. So today's class, I want you to get two things out of it. One is to begin to think about your own experiences with homophobia and to assess your own ability to work with gay or lesbian couples or individuals within a family context. So what is your own comfort level? What are your own experiences with homophobia and heteronormativity? So think about those things. Also, I want you to continue to apply some of these concepts of intersectionality and think about the unique challenges and strengths of older gays and lesbians, and also how that intersects the GLBTQ identity with spiritual and faith identities. So continued discussions of intersectionality and of negotiation of identities. So gay and lesbian couples and family, I think from the reading you'll see that that's a population that's much more visible today. You have 2 to 4 million children living with gay or lesbian parents, so that's probably much more common today, both through adoption and also because you probably have a lot more couples now living as gay or lesbian couples compared to the past, where people may have been in a heterosexual relationship in order to have children. Also, in terms of issues of being transgender, transsexual parents, that's really not been explored in the literature, and there's not too much even in these readings on that particular issue, but that's still sort of a gap in terms of our knowledge. Also, just thinking about historically in context, lesbian and gay parenting has been viewed as detrimental to children. But in reality, research supports that there's really no difference between children in homosexual versus heterosexual parent households on gender development, personal development, social relationships, and sexual orientation. So that that perception or view that this could potentially be detrimental to children does not play out in the research. For people who grow up gay or lesbian, I think it's important to, one, is understand that that awareness comes very early. Gay men typically at about 5 to 6 years old, and lesbians at about 12 to 13 years old. And also just remember that they're growing up in a context where, and they live as adults in a context where both the cultural and historical context does not reflect their lives. So everything from the language that's used, different rituals that we have in our culture like marriage, baptisms, just all kinds of different social and cultural transitions and norms that that does not reflect the reality of their lives. So Neely, in his chapter, talks a little bit about similarities to both to immigrants, and also, given your experience with the previous week's readings, I think that you can see some similarities to our previous discussions on transracial adoptions, and I hope that you continue to think about that as you do the reading, as you think about your discussion. So the first thing here, in terms of being a clinician and working with this population, is you want to check your own assumptions and assumptions in the literature and what we're reading and learning. So this idea of heteronormativity, basically that the heterosexual is the norm, that's going to impact research and clinical theory. So just like we talk about different marginalized populations in terms of ethnicity or race and bringing their experience to the center in terms of the development of theory, the same thing is going on with this population, in the sense that the reality of their lives is not really reflected, and that's not what has been the foundation or basis of existing clinical theory. Also, when we come from this perspective of heteronormativity, and there's this overemphasis on showing that children growing up in those households are the same, right? We want to show that they're the same as children growing up in heterosexual families. But in reality, there may be some differences and some strengths for those children, but we're so concerned about, the heterosexual couple being the norm in terms of the head of the household, that we want to show that these children are the same as children growing up in heterosexual families. But some of the research shows that in reality, these children do have strengths that other children don't have, in the sense that they tend to have much less rigid gender expression. And in some ways, say that you have this combination of transracial adoption with a gay and lesbian family. What the research is finding is that gay and lesbian families are actually somewhat more in tune and can deal with the issues of race in some ways better than heterosexual white families, mainly because they have their own personal experience with oppression and being a minority and dealing with those kinds of things. So when their children are dealing with racism, they have some basis for being able to relate and understand their experiences, and can help them through some of that in a way that a heterosexual white couple has more difficulty doing, because it's going to take them a lot more work to get to the point that they really understand that child's experience. Have a lot more gay and lesbian families actually doing some of this transracial adoption. There's very little in the literature. There's very little overlap between how we understand transracial adoption and what happens within gay and lesbian families, and what that means even for other identities. So you'll see from the literature that there's this separation, when in reality it's something that we should think about together. Also, the current research does not consider issues of transgender or transsexual individuals, so you're not going to see a lot of that in your clinical readings in journal articles or books. And then just understand that when that gay and lesbian family comes to see you, especially when they're having issues with their children, think about the pressure that they're under, because they're under extreme societal pressure. So not only their individual pressure as parents to want to do the right thing for their children, but also this external pressure to raise quote-unquote normal children. And if something is wrong with their children, then there's concern that they would somehow be blamed because of their own sexual orientation. So there's this added societal pressure to those families in terms of dealing with difficulties with their children. The reading also deals with the issue of negotiating identity, particularly around spiritual identities. So I just want you guys to really think about that concept as well. How does that intersection of a spiritual identity and a gay and lesbian identity work? And what is that identity work? And how do gay and lesbian individuals or transgender individuals come to terms with that? What do they do? What kind of identity responses do they have to that particular situation? And of course, a lot of that is because religious culture, it often creates very homophobic environments. So it's a real struggle for these individuals to integrate their spiritual identities and their sexual identities. There's also a lot of association with distress, shame, internalized homophobia, depression, suicidal ideation. There may be overlap. So again, thinking about concepts of intersectionality, overlap between cultural and spiritual identities that causes an additional distress. So say that somebody is from a Mexican background and their Mexican family is very involved in the Catholic Church and very Catholic. Yet that's a church that may or may not, that actually does not really accept, gay or lesbian individuals. So in some ways, separating from their spiritual identity has implications for their cultural identity as well. So thinking about for some individuals when spiritual identities and cultural identities intersect, then what does that mean for their sexual identities and how do they navigate those worlds? So often it's more than navigating two social worlds, it's navigating multiple social worlds as they deal with these different intersections of oppressions and identities. So how do people respond to that? They may develop a sense of spirituality outside organized religion. Some people convert from a non-affirming to an affirming religion. Some individuals completely reject God and religion altogether. Some continue to participate, but feel a sense of shame or guilt as a result of that participation. And some have always been comfortable with their spiritual identities, and it's not really an issue for them. And some continue to struggle and have difficulty sort of figuring that out for themselves. So in terms of a therapist, I think again, and this is where that whole concept of symbolic interactionism and social constructivism comes into play, that instead of focusing so much on disorder and DSM diagnoses, focus on the meaning-making processes that impede that adjustment. So in other words, how are people making sense of their experiences? What does that experience mean to them? And how do they make meaning out of both experiences of oppression and also make meaning out of experiences in a way that allows them to negotiate a new identity or have a new understanding of themselves and their identity in a way that is much more empowering. Conversion therapy, and there's an article that you have in your reading on conversion therapy. It is unsuccessful, it is detrimental to mental health, and violates ethics. So conversion therapy is absolutely unethical and should never, ever be used. And please, the article really discusses a lot more about that, but just know that therapy it violates ethics because it's detrimental. It harms people. And again, as we started the slide about sort of thinking about your own feelings, so you need to have your own self-awareness about your own feelings about sexual orientation and your own comfort level about dealing with sexual orientation and individuals with different sexual identities and sexual orientations. So this feminist approach, what does it mean in this context? It means paying attention to language. So again, layers of meaning in the narrative, symbolic interactionism, because we create meaning through words, through language. So what is the language that's used? So being very sensitive to how we talk about things and the words that we use and the words that others use. Really focus on the experience and that person's reality. Also think about those socio-cultural variables as the etiology of psychopathology, and that's what makes you distinct as a social worker compared to other professions, right? You're not necessarily looking at the pathology of individuals, you're looking at how on a societal level there could be pathology that creates distress in individuals, and particularly with populations that are so marginalized, like the GLBTQ population. It's very important to think about the larger societal structures and culture and how that impacts the individual distress. And your own commitment to social change. So what is your commitment as a social worker to be an ally to this population, and what does that mean? So thinking about that and being collaborative with your client, and also disclosing your own thoughts or feelings or comfort level about sexuality with your client so that they understand clearly where you're coming from and they can make an informed decision about whether or not you're someone they can work with. So this is a quote from one of the readings, and again emphasizing that point about how important it is to be candid with your clients about what your own values are relating to gender, relating to ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. Because your clients need to know where you stand. They need to know, have this information so that, again, that they know whether they want to keep working with you or not. So what are some of the implications? It's really important to think about identifying strengths in lesbian and gay couples and family clients. Affirm that a lesbian gay lifestyle is a valid lifestyle and make sure that comes through in the language and how you talk about things with these particular clients. And then help also your clients. This could be a really useful thing in terms of helping them differentiate between their own internal struggles and intrapsychic problems and those that are external problems. So developing a very supportive network, again, is very important, particularly for people who are very marginalized or who feel marginalized or isolated. And helping lesbian and gay clients work through their own discomfort with their own sexuality as issues arise with their children. So some clients will have through the experience of raising their children, of course, for a lot of parents, this is going to raise their own insecurities or their own discomfort or worries or shame or about their own sexuality, and as I referred to earlier, that societal pressure to raise quote-unquote normal children. So here are some questions that I want you to think about for your Blackboard discussion. Okay, so I want you to think about the readings and think about, again, and discuss how intersectionality relates to this population. I want you to also address the concepts of intersectionality as they relate to GLBTQ older adults. And I also want you to reflect on and think about and discuss how this experience parallels the immigrant population that you guys spent quite a bit of time learning and thinking about last semester, and also how this is similar or different to transracial adoptees. So, just last week's readings. What are those common themes that this population also experiences? Are there ways that they're different? And I just want you to reflect on and think about, what did you learn the most from this reading? What stood out to you the most from this week? And post your thoughts about these questions in the Blackboard. Okay? Thank you very much. See you guys in person next week.